Some moments arrive without fanfare. They don't announce themselves with thunder or spectacle. Instead, they slip into the world quietly, like the gentle whisper of boarding announcements over an intercom, or the subtle rustling of coat sleeves brushing against leather seats. On this morning, that was exactly how Amira Bennett entered the first-class cabin of Flight 326, boarding pass in hand, hoodie pulled over her tight curls, sneakers laced and gleaming white beneath jeans cuffed just above her ankles. She looked every bit like a teenager traveling alone for the first time, except for how she carried herself. There was a quiet composure about her, the kind that isn't taught but earned. Over years of knowing how to navigate spaces where people glance twice, not because of who you are, but who they assume you aren't. Amira had been through that dance before, but today wasn't supposed to be one of those days. Her father had gifted her this ticket, a surprise after her report card came in with straight A's and 2 academic distinctions. He'd even upgraded her to seat 1A, telling her with that rare softness, "You deserve to see the world from the front." She had smiled then, touched not just by the gesture, but by what it meant. Trust. It was more than just a plane ticket. It was permission to step into a space that generations before her were denied, not because of merit, but because of perception. Now, as she eased into the wide leather seat by the window, placing her backpack beneath her feet, Amira felt a flicker of pride mixed with anticipation. This was her moment, her milestone. And then came the click of heels, measured, sharp, authoritative. The woman approaching wore her uniform like armor, every thread pressed, every button shining. Samantha Raines had been a flight attendant for nearly 20 years. She was the kind of woman who didn't just believe in rules. She embodied them. To her, order was paramount. She prided herself on a kind of elegance that came from structure, protocol, and her sense of judgment, which she often confused with instinct. Her eyes scanned the cabin like a security camera disguised in human form. When she spotted Amira, something shifted, barely perceptible to most, but unmistakable if you've lived through it. Her lips pursed ever so slightly, her shoulders squared. She approached slowly, deliberately, like someone preparing to fix what she believed was a problem. "Good morning," Samantha said, the words as cold as the air-conditioned breeze sneaking through the overhead vents. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Amira looked up, momentarily startled. She wasn't expecting conversation, let alone confrontation. She nodded, polite but firm. "Yes, 1A." Samantha's smile didn't reach her eyes. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" There was no warmth in her tone, only protocol wielded like a blade. Amira, slightly flustered but still calm, reached into the pocket of her hoodie and handed it over. The paper was pristine, her name printed, her seat number undeniable. But Samantha stared at it for longer than necessary, as if waiting for the ink to rearrange itself and reveal a mistake. Around them, the other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some peeked over newspapers or tablets. A few looked out the window, pretending not to notice. Not one said a word. Because that's how it usually happens, with silence. Not from the accused, but from the witnesses who choose complicity over courage. Samantha's eyes flicked from the ticket back to Amira's face. Her mouth tightened. "This seat is reserved for first-class passengers," she said flatly. "I am a first-class passenger," Amira responded, her voice still low but now edged with confusion. Samantha didn't respond. Instead, she held out her hand for Amira's boarding pass again, as though the first reading had been a trick of the eye. When nothing changed on the ticket, she exhaled quietly, almost as if disappointed. "Please gather your things," she said. "I'll have to ask you to move to the back." There may have been a mistake at the gate. Amira sat frozen for a beat. The pride she'd carried with her onto this plane, the quiet anticipation, the excitement, it all began to crumble. Not because she didn't know what this was, but because she did. There hadn't been a mistake at the gate. The mistake, as always, was in the assumption of those who believe certain faces don't belong in certain seats. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. Instead, she nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her backpack. Her phone buzzed once. A message from her father. "Let me know once you've boarded." She didn't respond right away. As she stood to leave, her gaze caught a man seated just across the aisle. He looked to be in his early 50s. Dark suit, blue tie, face partially hidden behind a pair of reading glasses. He hadn't said a word either, but something about his stillness felt intentional, like someone watching a storm before choosing when to speak. Amira moved down the aisle, shoulders tight, eyes down. Samantha didn't glance back. She simply tucked the boarding pass into her pocket and turned to resume her duties, satisfied that she had restored order. The man in the suit watched her retreating figure with a gaze that did not blink. Then he pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and said quietly but clearly, "This is Daniel Bennett. I need to speak to flight operations. Now." And just like that, the real turbulence began. The first-class cabin of Flight 326 settled into a brittle, deceptive calm. The leather seats gleamed under soft golden lights. Champagne flutes clinked faintly against tray tables, and the slow hum of engines masked the tension that now quietly pulsed beneath the surface. Passengers returned to their screens and novels, some too polite to comment, others too comfortable to care. But for Amira Bennett, who now sat 3 cabins back, crammed into a middle seat in economy, that silence was deafening. The ache wasn't in her body. It was deeper than that. It settled into the space just behind her chest, where pride turns into something quieter and heavier when it's stripped away in front of strangers. Her hands were still folded over the backpack in her lap, knuckles white. The seatbelt across her waist bit into her sweatshirt. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. Her phone sat on top of the backpack, unlocked. The screen showed a single message, unfinished. She had typed it moments after being displaced. She took my seat, said it wasn't for me, didn't even check the ticket. Her thumb hovered over the send button, trembling slightly. Then she tapped send. Meanwhile, back in first class, Samantha Raines adjusted the cuffs of her uniform, smoothing away an invisible wrinkle as she made her way toward the galley. Her expression was unreadable, poised, distant. It was the same look she'd used for years, the one that told people, "I am in control. I don't make mistakes." But inside, a flicker of unease had begun to stir. Something about the man in seat 1B, the way he'd watched her, not judgmental, not surprised, just steady, quiet, like he had already decided something about her, and she didn't like not knowing what that was. Samantha hated surprises. She returned to the service area to prepare pre-flight beverages, but the silence around her crew members felt different now. Melanie Cruz, the youngest of the flight attendants, handed her a napkin a little too quickly and avoided eye contact. Another crew member, Jared, busied himself with stacking plastic cups that were already perfectly aligned. It was as if the energy had shifted, something unspoken hanging between them. Back in the cockpit, Captain Hughes was scanning the final flight logs when his earpiece buzzed. "Captain, this is Control. Priority communication from the corporate channel 2. Encrypted." He frowned and toggled the switch. The voice on the other end was clipped and unmistakably senior. "This is Bennett. We've just had an incident involving my daughter. She was seated in 1A. A crew member forcibly removed her without just cause. I'm on board. This is not to be treated as a seating error. This is a matter of conduct, and it requires immediate attention." Captain Hughes didn't blink. He had flown for 30 years. He'd heard his share of passenger complaints, seen everything from drunken outbursts to mid-air medical emergencies. But this had a different weight. Daniel Bennett was not just a CEO. He was the CEO. The man whose vision had pulled Aurelia Air from bankruptcy a decade ago. A single word from him could reroute an entire company's future. "Yes, sir," Hughes replied. "I'll handle it personally." 10 minutes later, a discreet call was made to Samantha via the cabin intercom. "Ms. Raines, Captain Hughes requests your presence in the cockpit." The words rang out over the speaker, low but clear. Passengers glanced up. Melanie froze with a coffee pot in midair. Samantha's jaw clenched, but she nodded, setting down her clipboard and walking toward the front. She stepped into the cockpit with practiced grace, but Captain Hughes was not smiling. Beside him, the flight operations officer had already appeared on the screen via secure live video. His face was stoic, voice clipped. "Ms. Raines, we've received a formal notice from Mr. Daniel Bennett regarding your interaction with his daughter." Samantha blinked. His daughter? Her heart skipped. Seat 1A. "You removed a passenger from first class based on What exactly? The officer asked. She was in the wrong seat, Samantha replied quickly, standing straighter. She didn't look. I assumed. She stopped herself. Her voice cracked faintly, and that was all it took. The officer's gaze didn't soften. Did you check her boarding pass? I glanced at it. Did you verify the seat and name? I I didn't recognize the name, she admitted. Captain Hughes interjected, his tone even but direct. So you made a judgment call, based not on evidence but appearance? The air in the cockpit thinned. Samantha's silence spoke louder than any denial. Her hands twisted at the hem of her sleeve. Ms. Raines, the officer continued, you're now required to return to that passenger, apologize in full view of the cabin, and escort her back to her original seat. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Samantha whispered. And when we land, the officer added, you will be escorted directly to a review board for a formal inquiry. Mr. Bennett has already authorized it. You're not to contact the passenger again outside of this apology. Is that clear? Samantha nodded again, cheeks burning with a shame she hadn't felt since her early years in training. The tone of the conversation was not disciplinary, it was surgical, cold, final. She stepped out of the cockpit slowly, walking back toward first class. Every step echoed like a warning bell. Passengers watched her more closely now. Something was different in the air. Something irreversible had been set into motion. And in seat 1B, Daniel Bennett leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. He didn't turn his head, didn't say a word, but his eyes followed her, calm and exacting, like a verdict already passed. At the back of the plane, Amira's phone buzzed again. New message. Sit tight. They know. You'll be back in 1A soon. She stared at the screen, her chest tightening, not with fear, but with something closer to vindication. Her father was on board. He had seen everything, and justice, quiet as it might seem now, had already taken flight. The aisle stretched before Samantha Raines like a corridor of reckoning. It had always been a path of control for her, a space where she was the authority, where her voice determined tempo and tone. But now, every step forward felt like a descent into an uncharted space where her power was not only questioned, but unraveling. She straightened her jacket, chin lifted, shoulders squared as she walked past first class. For the first time in her career, the glances from passengers didn't feel like recognition. They felt like judgment. Even Jared, the senior crew member who had once followed her every instruction without hesitation, avoided eye contact. Melanie stood beside the beverage cart, eyes locked on Samantha with a blend of quiet unease and subtle disappointment. It was the kind of silence that said more than any spoken reprimand. As Samantha neared the economy cabin, a low murmur rippled through a few passengers who had witnessed the earlier exchange. They nudged each other gently, eyebrows raised in silent understanding. The tension in the air was thicker now, and the mood transformed from passive acceptance to quiet anticipation. Amira sat still in seat 22B, earbuds in, but no music playing. Her fingers tapped idly against her phone screen, though she wasn't reading anything. When she saw Samantha's polished shoes stop beside her, she slowly removed one earbud and looked up. There was no anger on her face, no visible outrage, just a stillness that startled Samantha more than any raised voice would have. Amira's eyes were calm but clear, like deep water before a storm. Miss Bennett, Samantha began, her voice thin, trying to find footing on a ground that had crumbled. There appears to have been a misunderstanding. Amira didn't respond immediately. Her posture didn't shift. She simply looked at Samantha with that same quiet focus. And in the seconds that followed, it became painfully obvious to everyone in earshot that this wasn't going to be a simple fix. You saw my ticket, Amira said, softly but with deliberate control. Why did you assume I didn't belong in seat 1A? Samantha froze. The question wasn't asked in defiance. It was asked in truth. And truth, when spoken plainly, has a way of piercing through even the most practiced defenses. I thought, Samantha began, but the words tripped over each other. There are often seat errors. I assumed it was a mistake. Did you ask anyone else for their ticket? Amira's tone didn't change. Anyone else in first class? Samantha's throat tightened. She didn't answer. The surrounding passengers began to turn slightly, subtly leaning into the conversation. The silence was no longer neutral. It had weight, it had a shape. It formed a collective witness to what was no longer a private interaction, but a public moment of reckoning. From the front of the plane, Daniel Bennett remained seated, hands clasped in his lap. He had not risen. He had not intervened. He didn't need to. He had given Amira the space to speak, not as his daughter, but as a young woman reclaiming her voice in a room that had tried to silence it. Samantha's shoulders slumped ever so slightly. The authority in her frame gave way to something smaller, more human. Her voice was faint as she said, "You're right. I didn't check properly. I made an assumption." Amira nodded once. The acknowledgement was received, but not resolved. "Then this isn't a misunderstanding," she said gently. "It's a judgment, and it was wrong." The woman in the window seat beside Amir, who hadn't spoken a word since boarding, shifted slightly. Her hand reached out, resting lightly on Amira's arm. It was the first gesture of support since the ordeal began. A small one, but enough. "I've been asked to escort you back to first class," Samantha said, her words almost mechanical now. Amira stood slowly, lifting her backpack with graceful precision. She didn't look around. She didn't gloat. She simply stepped into the aisle and began walking forward. And with each step back toward 1A, the tension in the cabin changed again. Now it wasn't just about a seat, it was about visibility, about every unspoken assumption that had built the invisible barrier she had just walked through. She returned to the front of the plane with Samantha trailing a respectful distance behind. Melanie watched them pass, then glanced toward Jared, who gave a slight nod. Something unspoken had shifted within the crew. A mirror had been held up, and what it reflected wasn't just Samantha's failing, but a culture that had long allowed it to happen without consequence. When Amira reached her original seat, Daniel stood. He said nothing, but his eyes met hers and the silence between them was filled with mutual understanding. She nodded, and he offered the faintest, proudest smile she had ever seen from him. As she sat down, Samantha paused. "I'm sorry," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "for treating you unfairly, for assuming things I had no right to assume." The apology was stiff, imperfect, but real. Amira nodded once more. "Thank you," she said, voice steady. "I hope next time someone doesn't need to be somebody's daughter to be treated with respect." With that, she turned to the window. The clouds outside drifted by slowly, indifferent to what had happened inside the plane. But within this sealed capsule soaring through the sky, something had shifted. Not just for Amira, not just for Samantha, for everyone. Justice, when delivered quietly, lingers longer. The hum of the engines provided a rhythmic backdrop to the silence now draped over the first-class cabin. It was the kind of silence that wasn't born of peace, but of reckoning, thick, aware, and impossible to ignore. Amira sat in her rightful seat. 1A, the leather armrest cool beneath her elbow, the window framing an expanse of sky too wide to hold her thoughts. Samantha Raines had retreated to the galley, her posture tight, every step rehearsed but slightly off-tempo, like an actress who had just forgotten a crucial line mid-performance. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the beverage cart, pretending to rearrange items that were already perfectly aligned. Her polished professionalism, once a source of pride, now felt like a costume that no longer fit. Melanie Cruz, who had remained silent for most of the flight, finally stepped forward. She gently placed a hand on Samantha's wrist. "You okay?" Melanie asked softly. Samantha flinched, then quickly masked it with a faint smile. "I'm fine." But Melanie didn't look away. Her voice lowered, edged with empathy, but anchored by truth. "You're sweating, and you're not fine. You made a mistake, Samantha." There was a pause, a long one. Then Samantha exhaled. It was the kind of breath one takes when the ground beneath them is no longer steady. "She didn't look like she belonged," Samantha said quietly. "I didn't mean... It wasn't about race." Melanie raised an eyebrow, her tone quiet but deliberate. "Then what was it about?" That question hovered in the galley like condensation on the coffee pot, small but impossible to wipe away. Meanwhile, back in 1A, Amira placed her phone on airplane mode and slid it into the side pocket. She didn't need messages or updates anymore. The truth had already been written, carved in the silence, in the stares, in the slight shift in how flight attendants now addressed her. Even the passengers nearby seemed altered. One older man across the aisle, a well-dressed businessman who had initially ignored the incident, cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward her. "I saw what happened," he said gently. "That was wrong. You handled it with grace." Amira gave him a polite smile, but her voice held a quiet weight. "That's the thing. If I'd cried or shouted, I'd be seen as emotional. If I stayed calm, I'm told I'm impressive. Either way, I'm being measured." The man blinked, caught off guard by the sharp truth of it. He nodded slowly, the gravity of her words settling into his expression. Back in the cockpit, Captain Hughes had just received an update from operations. Daniel Bennett's complaint had escalated. A review board was assembling. A full inquiry was being logged. The internal system flagged the incident as level 1, high visibility. He rubbed his temple. He'd flown senators, athletes, tech moguls. But this was different, because Daniel Bennett wasn't just a high-profile figure. He was here, watching, listening, and choosing silence, not as inaction, but as power. Captain Hughes turned to the co-pilot. "We're going to have company at the gate," he said quietly. "Executive level." The co-pilot nodded. "Understood." 20 rows back, Samantha remained frozen near the galley, her pulse fluttering against her collar. The intercom buzzed again. A message came through from flight operations. Melanie glanced at the screen, read it silently, then looked up. "They're sending someone to meet the flight on landing," she said. Samantha paled. "Security?" "Senior executive," Melanie clarified, but her tone offered no comfort. "You'll need to answer questions. Face to face." Samantha gripped the edge of the counter. Her whole career, a decade of flawless service, commendations, leadership, was suddenly hanging by a thread she hadn't even known she was pulling apart, and she couldn't stop hearing Amira's words. "I hope next time someone doesn't need to be somebody's daughter to be treated with respect." In seat 1B, Daniel Bennett watched the sky beyond his window. His phone rested on his lap, screen locked, but his mind was a flurry of calculated decisions, public statements, and potential consequences. He wasn't thinking like a father anymore. He was thinking like a CEO, and he was already drafting policy, bias training, new reporting structures, mandatory ticket verification protocols for all seating conflicts. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a correction. And not just for one flight attendant, but for the system that had created her confidence in acting without question. The seatbelt sign flicked on. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please return to your seats and ensure all personal items are stowed securely." Amira looked out the window, watching clouds peel away to reveal the curve of the earth beneath them. She wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly, but something inside her had changed. The air smelled different. Her skin felt more alert. It wasn't trauma, it was awakening. Melanie came forward quietly and crouched beside her. "I just want to say, I'm sorry for what happened earlier," she whispered. "I should have said something when I saw it." Amira turned to her, surprised by the admission. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's not too late." Melanie nodded, and in that exchange, simple, human, unguarded, a quiet coalition was formed. Not allies by badge, but by courage. As the plane neared the runway, the weight of what had unfolded in the air began its descent with them, not just in altitude, but in consequence. Every passenger now sat a little more upright. Every crew member checked their name tags a little more cautiously, because when the doors opened in 15 minutes, this flight wouldn't just be landing at an airport, it would be arriving in the middle of a reckoning. The wheels of Flight 326 screeched gently against the tarmac, a routine landing met with anything but routine energy. Within the cabin, no one spoke. There was the soft shuffle of seat belts being unfastened too early, the rustle of newspapers being folded, but underneath it all, a collective stillness clung to every passenger, like humidity before a storm. Captain Hughes's familiar voice returned over the intercom, calm and clipped. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Local time is 3:47 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft comes to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign is turned off. But no one was listening to the arrival instructions. They were listening for the next moment, the moment everyone sensed was coming. From her seat in 1A, Amira Bennett watched as the airport buildings drew closer through the window, glass, steel, and people moving in the distance. She rested her chin in her hand, her expression unreadable. Behind her composure was something sharper than anger. Clarity. That specific kind of clarity that forms when humiliation is met not with chaos, but with quiet resistance. Her father sat beside her, legs crossed, tie loosened. Daniel Bennett hadn't spoken much during the final leg of the flight, but now as the aircraft taxied toward Gate 42, he reached for his phone again and typed a brief message. The recipient was waiting at the gate. So was the message. Execute. Quietly. Down the aisle, Samantha Raines stood rigidly by the galley, her hands clasped so tightly they had turned pale. The weight of what she had done, what she now understood she had done, pressed down on her spine like a lead bar. Her training manual hadn't prepared her for this. Melanie Cruz, watching from across the cabin, could feel the air shift. She had only been with Aurelia Air for 11 months, but she already knew something irreversible had happened. Not just to Samantha, to all of them, to the culture that told you who to question, who to serve faster, and who to double-check. The plane finally stopped. The soft chime of the seatbelt light turning off echoed like the toll of a bell. Passengers rose slowly, not with the usual frenzy, but with a wariness, a sense that something formal and grave was about to unfold. And it did. Before the doors even opened fully, two figures in tailored Navy suits stepped onto the jet bridge and into the aircraft. One was tall, silver-haired, with the quiet confidence of someone used to boardrooms and crisis meetings. The other, younger, with a black leather folder tucked beneath his arm. "Ms. Raines?" the older one asked as he stepped into the galley, voice low but undeniable. Samantha turned, her breath catching, before she even replied. "Yes, you'll need to come with us." Passengers nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Heads turned subtly. A few froze mid-reach for their overhead luggage. The younger executive stood silently to the side, opening his folder and removing a crisp, printed document. He handed it to Samantha. It was not a script. It was a notice. A preliminary disciplinary summons, signed and approved by the Office of Executive Oversight, was issued by direct order of Daniel Bennett. She scanned the paper. Her knees wobbled slightly. She began, "is there a problem?" The older executive's eyes didn't flinch. "There's an incident. You are the subject of an inquiry into discriminatory conduct toward a first-class passenger." A beat. "Mr. Bennett?" Samantha asked hesitantly. The older man didn't need to answer, because just then Daniel Bennett stood up from seat 1B. His presence filled the space without raising his voice. He looked at Samantha and said simply, "Walk with them." Samantha opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her face, once always composed under the polish of airline authority, was now transparent, tight with panic, flushed with shame. She stepped forward. Every row she passed felt like a silent gallery. Eyes followed her like a slow wave. Some passengers showed surprise. Others showed nothing. But a few, especially the younger ones, watched her like she was a headline they'd been waiting for. Amira remained seated as Samantha passed. She didn't smirk. She didn't glare. She simply held her gaze. And that silence between them, that breathless, haunting quiet, spoke louder than any public outcry ever could. Claire walked out of the plane, flanked on both sides. When the door closed behind her, it was as if a curtain had fallen, not on the flight, but in the era that had allowed people like her to act without accountability. Passengers began to collect their things, but none of them moved the same. Even in the noise of zippers and shifting bags, a strange hush remained. Melanie stepped forward again, gently assisting an elderly woman with her overhead luggage. Her movements were slow, intentional. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't performing. She was present. As the line of passengers slowly began to shuffle out, Amira stood and collected her things. Her father held her backpack for her. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him. I've been ready. Together they stepped into the aisle, moving forward, not just off the plane, but toward whatever came next. The gate beyond them buzzed with the usual energy of airport life. But this time, the world outside didn't feel so indifferent. Something had changed. Not enough, but something. Because one teenage girl had refused to disappear quietly. Because a father had chosen not to roar, but to act with precision. And because justice, when it lands, doesn't need an audience. It just needs the truth. And someone brave enough to carry it down the aisle. The hallway just beyond Gate 42 was bright, almost painfully so. Fluorescent lights hummed above, reflecting off the polished floor like a stage left empty after a play. But for Samantha Raines, the performance wasn't over. It had only shifted venues. She walked between the two executives like a defendant in an invisible courtroom. Her steps were steady, but only barely. The notice in her hand trembled with each movement, its paper creasing along the fold lines she had unconsciously gripped too tightly. The words on the page weren't long, but their weight pressed into her like a verdict she hadn't prepared for. Just behind the frosted glass door at the end of the hallway was a room known internally as D43, a space reserved for internal investigations and compliance reviews. Samantha had passed by it hundreds of times during her career. She'd even referred junior staff there for minor infractions: failure to file reports, late arrival to crew briefings, missed uniform inspections. But she had never walked through that door herself. Until now. Inside the room, the walls were a sterile off-white. A single wooden table stood at the center, surrounded by three high-backed chairs. On one side sat James Walton, Executive Director of Internal Compliance for Aurelia Air, a man known not for dramatic speeches, but for surgical, quiet decisions that rarely made headlines, but always left an impact. Next to him sat Daniel Crow, Director of Flight Operations. His salt and pepper hair was combed back with care, his blazer immaculately pressed. He didn't speak when Samantha entered. He simply motioned for her to sit. Samantha did. Walton didn't look up immediately. Instead, he flipped through a slim folder before him, filled with printed documents, time-stamped screenshots, and 3 passenger witness statements. On top of the stack was a photo taken mid-flight. Amira Bennett, standing in the aisle, face composed, shoulders squared. "Ms. Raines," Walton began, voice measured, "do you understand why you're here?" Samantha hesitated. "I believe I do." Crow finally looked up. "Then say it." She swallowed. "Because I asked a passenger to leave first class, and it was the wrong call." Walton leaned forward slightly. "Not just any passenger. You removed a first-class ticket holder without verifying her credentials. And worse, you made a judgment based solely on appearance. Do you deny that?" "No," Samantha said, her voice cracking. "I don't." Crow pushed the folder toward her. "You had her ticket in hand. The seat number was correct. The name matched. What made you think she didn't belong?" Silence. "I didn't recognize the name," she said weakly. "And I've never seen someone that young in 1A alone before." Walton arched a brow. "You didn't recognize the name Bennett?" Samantha's lips parted slightly. The mistake she had made was so much larger than she'd realized at the time, and now it stared back at her, unblinking, from across the table. "She was Mr. Bennett's daughter," Crow confirmed, his voice flat. "And Mr. Bennett was seated 24 inches away from you when it happened. He saw everything. He remained silent so you could show who you were without interference." The words hit Samantha harder than she expected. He had allowed her to do the right thing, and she had failed. Walton closed the folder. "You're being suspended immediately, without pay. You'll receive notice of a disciplinary hearing within 72 hours. Until then, you are not to contact any crew members or employees. Do you understand?" Samantha nodded, but her voice had gone. Her world, the structure, the protocol, the identity she had wrapped herself in for over a decade, was peeling away like paint in a room left too long in the sun. When they dismissed her, she walked out slowly. The hallway was emptier now. There was no applause, no audience. Just the echo of her footsteps and the feeling that the authority she had once carried so confidently had collapsed into something brittle and hollow. Across the terminal, in a quieter, more refined space, Amira sat in the executive lounge beside her father. The lounge was a contrast to everything that had just unfolded. Leather seating, warm lighting, and thick carpet that absorbed noise. It was a sanctuary, but Amira didn't look relaxed. She sat upright, sipping a ginger tea someone had brought her legs crossed neatly, her phone resting face down beside her. Daniel watched her carefully. He could see the storm behind her stillness, the restraint, the echoes of something lodged deep, not just from today, but from 100 small moments like it, this one simply louder. "You okay?" he asked. Amira turned to him. "I'm better." "She's been suspended," he said, not with satisfaction, but with resolution. "The hearing will determine if she returns at all." Amira nodded slowly. "Good." Then she added, "But this isn't just about her." Daniel leaned in. "She was just the one who got caught," Amira continued. "But how many others have done the same thing quietly, without someone like you watching?" He exhaled. She was right. This couldn't end with one disciplinary review. It had to become something more. That night, Daniel made 2 calls. The first was to the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Aurelia Air. The second was to the Board of Directors. By morning, a plan was in motion. A mandatory industry-first initiative, See Me, Acknowledge and Act. A sweeping reform program focused on unconscious bias, equitable treatment, and transparent accountability for all levels of staff. Not as PR, not as damage control, but as a cultural overhaul. For Amira, that meant the humiliation she endured wouldn't be in vain. For Samantha, it meant her apology, if it ever came, would be weighed not against what she lost, but what others might gain because of her fall. And for everyone who had been quietly pushed aside on flights, in boardrooms, in banks, in restaurants, and in classrooms, this was not a conclusion. It was a beginning. By sunrise the next day, the press had caught the scent. It started as a quiet ripple across aviation forums. Passenger murmurs turned into anonymous posts, then into screenshots shared on Reddit threads. Flight 326. Something happened. CEO's daughter was humiliated in first class. Aurelia Air executive sat right there, said nothing, until after. And then came the leak. A video taken discreetly from seat 3C, shaky but damning, captured the moment Samantha Raines stood over Amira Bennett, questioning her seat assignment with a look that many knew too well. The voice in the clip wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The tone, sharp, cold, dismissive, was enough. And just as powerful as the clip itself was, the visible silence of everyone around. Not a single passenger had spoken. Not one had stood. By noon, the clip had gone viral. Your seat 1IA began trending across platforms. Your seam followed shortly after. A tweet from a prominent black journalist read, "She didn't scream, she didn't protest, she didn't cry. She just asked, 'Why did you think I didn't belong?'" And the world is answering that question now. At Aurelia Air headquarters, the comms team was already preparing a statement when Daniel Bennett arrived at the building. He waved off all greetings. His face was unreadable, but every movement, every nod, every pause was precise. He didn't need spin. He needed a change. "Where are we with the review process?" he asked, entering the crisis boardroom. The team stood to attention. "Raines has been suspended," said Chief of Staff Lorraine Gupta. "Hearing scheduled in 48 hours. We've received over 300 public inquiries, and the clip has been viewed 7.1 million times across platforms." Daniel's fingers tapped once against the glass table. "Internal morale?" Lorraine hesitated. "Divided. Some older crew members feel blindsided. Others, especially newer hires, are asking why this didn't happen sooner." Daniel leaned forward. "Then it's time to draw the line." He tapped his phone and cast a prepared slide onto the screen behind him. Across it, in bold lettering, "See Me, Acknowledge and Act." The proposal was clear. Every employee, from gate agent to pilot, would undergo immersive bias training, scenario reenactments, and panel discussions with real passengers who had experienced discrimination. Reporting systems would be rebuilt, whistleblower protections strengthened, and for the first time in Aurelia's history, every flight would have a rotating third-party equity officer on select routes. No more passive silence, no more unseen moments. And for those who refused the training, termination, no exceptions. Back at home, Samantha Raines sat on the edge of her bed, still in uniform pants, though she hadn't worn the jacket since yesterday. Her apartment, once neatly arranged, now looked like a place someone had walked out of in a rush and never fully returned to. Her airline-issued tablet had been locked. Her email access has been revoked. She opened her phone. The inbox was a mix of messages, some supportive, others brutal. A few from former colleagues, cautious but curious. What happened? One message simply read, "Was it worth it?" She didn't answer any of them. Instead, she opened the one thing she'd been avoiding all morning, an email from Amira Bennett. Subject line, clarity. It wasn't long, not angry, not even accusatory, just a single paragraph that hit harder than any formal reprimand. Ms. Raines, you didn't yell at me. You didn't curse, but you decided in one glance that I didn't belong. You saw a hoodie and brown skin and youth, and you let that override the fact that I had a ticket in my hand. You saw the seat, not the person. I don't want vengeance, but I do want you to sit with that truth, and then decide who you want to be in the air and on the ground. Amira Samantha read the message 3 times. Her hands trembled, not from fear of being fired, but from the weight of recognition. No excuse she could offer would erase the simplicity of Amira's truth. Later that day, she wrote a draft of her apology, then deleted it, wrote it again, deleted it again. Across town, Amira sat with her mother in a quiet cafe overlooking the city. The sunlight played across her cheeks, and though her eyes were calm, the heaviness hadn't left. Not entirely. "I didn't expect it to go viral," she said softly. Her mother, tall, poised, and deliberate in everything, nodded. "You didn't do it for the world. You did it for yourself. The world just happened to be watching." Amira stirred her tea. "She'll probably lose her job." Her mother paused. "Maybe she should. Maybe she shouldn't. But either way, it's not about punishment. It's about understanding." Amira glanced down. "Do you think she understood?" Her mother reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "She will, because people like you exist to make sure they do." That night, as the city lights blinked to life and the sky deepened to indigo, a message arrived in Amira's inbox. From Samantha Raines. Subject line, "No defense, only truth." "Amira, I won't ask for forgiveness. I made a decision based on appearance and assumption. I didn't ask for your name. I didn't treat you with the dignity you deserved. I let my years of experience become a wall instead of a bridge. And I see that now. Not because I was caught, but because you asked a question I couldn't answer without confronting the worst in myself. Thank you for your calm, your voice, your grace. You reminded me of who I'm supposed to be. If I'm ever allowed to wear the uniform again, I'll do it with that memory at the front of my mind." Samantha Amira read the message once. She didn't reply. Not yet. Some messages are meant to sit for a while, to echo, to teach. It was 8:59 a.m. when Samantha Raines stepped into conference room D43 for the formal hearing. The room was brightly lit, but not inviting. The walls were bare. The table was long, and across from her sat 3 people, none of them smiling. At the center was James Walton, Executive Director of Internal Compliance. To his right, Lorraine Gupta, Chief of Staff for Aurelia Air. To his left, a new presence, Leah Monroe, a civil rights advisor recently brought in as part of the airline's Diversity Reform Committee. She wore no uniform, no name tag, just a navy blue blazer and a gaze that could pierce stone. Samantha entered not as the seasoned crew leader she once was, but as an employee under scrutiny. Her usual confidence, ironed crisp into every hem of her uniform, had vanished. She wasn't even wearing it today, just a plain gray blouse and black slacks, chosen carefully to appear modest, unassuming, invisible if possible. "Ms. Raines," Walton began, his voice calm but firm, "you're here today to provide your statement regarding the events on Flight 326, involving passenger Amira Bennett." Samantha nodded. "Yes, sir. You understand that this proceeding will determine whether your employment with Aurelia Air continues." "I do." Walton leaned forward slightly. "You've read the passenger reports, watched the footage, received the formal complaint." Samantha met his gaze. "I have." "Do you accept the facts as presented?" A pause, then, "Yes." There was no defense left. Not after the footage. Not after the witness accounts. And certainly not after the message from Amira that had left Samantha awake half the night, replaying every second of that flight. Lorraine Gupta took over. Ms. Rains, we've reviewed your history. 10 years of service. No major infractions. Commendations for leadership and reliability. Samantha swallowed, waiting. And yet, Lorraine continued, in the space of 3 minutes, you became a symbol, not for order, but for injustice. Can you explain what was going through your mind when you asked that young woman to move? Samantha blinked. Her mouth opened, then closed. She had rehearsed this answer, but when the moment arrived, she didn't use it. I saw a young black girl in a hoodie in 1A, she said quietly, and I didn't believe she belonged there. I didn't verify. I didn't ask questions. I just assumed. She paused, then added, I've always followed procedure, but that day I followed my bias, and I'm ashamed of it. Leah Monroe's voice came next, clear and even. Do you know how many employees say that only after they're caught? Samantha looked down. I do, and I understand if it doesn't sound like enough now. Because it isn't, Leah said gently, but without softening the edge of her point. A young woman boarded a plane with every right to her seat. She held her ticket. She followed the rules. And yet, because she didn't look like someone you expected to see there, you decided the rules didn't apply. That's not a slip. That's a failure. Samantha nodded, her hands clenched in her lap. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, she said. I'm here to own what I did, and I accept whatever outcome you decide. Silence followed. Heavy, settled. Then Walton spoke again. There are 2 possible paths forward. 1, termination, immediate and final. 2, conditional continuation under disciplinary action with mandatory participation in the CME initiative, not as a trainee, but as a speaker. You will present your failure, in your own words, in front of new hires, management, and executives. Samantha's head rose slowly. That wasn't what she expected. Walton went on. You will not lead. You will not supervise. For 1 year, you'll work under observation, and every flight will be subject to post-flight equity review. And, Lorraine added, your salary will be frozen. No promotions, no bonuses. Leah Monroe leaned forward. This is not a second chance. It's an obligation to repair harm. If you agree, you will sign this agreement and begin the process. If not, you may walk out today and close this chapter permanently. Samantha took the pen that slid toward her. Her signature was slow, deliberate. When she placed the pen down, her hands shook. I want to do it, she said. Not to save my job, but to be the kind of person I wasn't that day. The room stayed quiet for a few seconds longer. Then Walton gave a single nod. Then we begin. That evening, Amira sat alone on the rooftop terrace of her mother's townhouse, the city lights flickering below like a restless constellation. She held a letter in her hand, an official copy of the hearing outcome. Her name was listed in the summary as Affected Passenger A. Bennett. She read the document once, then she folded it and slipped it into a folder labeled Keep Going. Her mother stepped out with 2 mugs of peppermint tea, placing one beside her. Was it what you wanted? She asked gently. Amira stared out at the skyline. It's not about what I wanted, she said. It's about whether what happened to me means something now. And does it? Amira considered this, then nodded. It's a start. She opened her laptop and began drafting an essay for her college application. The prompt was simple. Describe a moment that changed the way you see the world. She wrote the title first, The Aisle Between Us. Then with quiet determination, she began. 3 weeks later, the ripple that began in seat 1A had become a current sweeping through the entire airline industry. News outlets continued covering the aftermath of Flight 326, not as a flash headline, but as a slow-burn story that wouldn't fade. Articles now focused less on the moment of humiliation and more on what followed. A shift, a recalibration, a reckoning. Aurelia Air had launched the CME initiative with an unprecedented internal broadcast across all departments. Gate agents, flight attendants, call center staff, ground crews, and even senior executives were required to attend immersive sessions. The first session, aired live, featured none other than Samantha Rains. She didn't wear a uniform. She wasn't introduced with titles. She simply stood in front of a group of newly hired employees, backlit by the company's logo, and said, "My name is Samantha. I was a lead flight attendant for 10 years, and I'm here because I made a choice on a quiet flight in a calm cabin to see someone not as a passenger, but as a mistake, because of how she looked." There was no script, just a raw, honest confession, and it reverberated far beyond the room. Clips from her speech, uploaded by staff attending virtually, spread across social media. Public reaction was divided. Some praised her accountability, others questioned the sincerity of someone who only spoke up after being forced. But the bigger headline wasn't her apology. It was that the airline let it happen publicly. In a system long known for protecting itself, Aurelia Air had broken the mold. Elsewhere, other airlines began quietly revisiting their training programs, their reporting policies, and their cabin crew procedures. Some began consulting with Aurelia's team. Others didn't admit the influence, but the timing spoke for itself. And all the while, Amira Bennett said nothing. Not online, not in interviews. She declined every media request. She didn't tweet. She didn't post. Instead, she lived. She studied. She attended her debate team meetings. She volunteered at a local community center, mentoring younger girls with college dreams and guarded hearts. But privately, she watched the headlines. She read the statements. She tracked the changes. Because silence didn't mean detachment. It meant intention. One Saturday morning, Amira joined her father, Daniel Bennett, at Aurelia's corporate campus. She had visited before, but today was different. Today, she wasn't a guest. She was a voice. The main auditorium was filled with executives, trainers, union reps, and staff from all over the country. They were there to witness the formal launch of CME Phase 2, focused on empowerment through testimony. Amira didn't want to speak, but she knew she had to. When her name was announced, the room quieted, not out of obligation but reverence. She walked to the podium, paused, then looked up. "I wasn't planning to speak," she began, "but I realized that staying silent now would feel like walking past the same injustice that tried to walk past me." She took a breath. "When I was told to leave my seat, I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I didn't record it. I just asked a question. And I learned that the right question at the right time can crack open a wall that's been standing for years." A few heads nodded in the crowd. "I'm not here today because I'm someone important. I'm here because I was treated like I wasn't. And because my father was watching, yes. But more importantly, because the world did." She paused again. "I don't want anyone to need a powerful name or a viral video to be seen. I want someone's presence to be enough. Their face, their voice, their humanity." As she stepped down, the applause was long, not thunderous, not theatrical, but deeply resonant. Daniel met her at the bottom of the stairs, his expression unreadable but proud. He placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "You just rewrote our company's history." She smiled faintly. "Let's make sure it stays rewritten." That evening, Samantha Raines sat alone in a training session as a participant, not a speaker. She had requested it herself, quietly without instruction. She didn't wear her name badge. She didn't correct anyone who didn't recognize her. When a facilitator asked the group to write down the moment they realized bias was real, Samantha wrote, "When I told someone to leave a space, she had every right to claim. Because I didn't see her, I saw what I feared." She didn't share it aloud, but it stayed in her notebook, a confession waiting to become conviction. After the session, she stepped outside into the dusk, the orange light washing over the campus. As she crossed the courtyard, she noticed a small bronze plaque newly installed near the fountain. It read, "To those who were told to move, to those who stayed seated, to those who asked, 'Why not me?' This space remembers you." Samantha stood in front of it for a long time. Then, for the first time in weeks, she breathed fully, not in defense, not in fear, but in clarity. Across the city, Amira returned to her desk and picked up where she left off, her college application essay. She reread her title, "The Aisle Between Us." And with a small smile, she added the final line, "I didn't move because I didn't belong. I stayed because I did." Autumn rolled in quietly. The trees outside Aurelia Air's headquarters turned gold and amber, casting warm shadows across the pavement. And with them came a season of reckoning, not just for an airline, but for an industry, a culture, a way of looking without really seeing. Inside a glass-paneled auditorium on the 18th floor, a quiet crowd gathered. Not press, not investors, but people. Crew members, gate agents, trainers, flight supervisors, union leaders, even custodial staff. Nearly 300 employees in uniform sat facing a modest stage with 2 armchairs and a sign overhead. See me, from policy to people. Daniel Bennett took the stage first, not with grandeur, but with calm gravity. He wore no suit jacket, just a charcoal shirt and rolled sleeves. The man who once ran meetings with shareholders now stood before his staff with a simple truth. He didn't open with statistics. He opened with a memory. I watched my daughter be asked to leave a seat she had earned. I watched her dignity questioned not because of anything she said or did, but because of what she looked like. Silence. I said nothing that day, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the system to show itself. And it did. He paused, letting the truth sit. For years, we've claimed to be an airline that sees all passengers equally, but it took one girl sitting quietly in 1A to show us where we were blind. He gestured gently to the side of the stage. Today, I'd like to invite her up. Amira Bennett rose from her seat in the front row and stepped onto the stage. There was no microphone click, no swelling music, just soft footsteps and the quiet inhale of hundreds watching. She sat beside her father, legs crossed, hands folded loosely in her lap. There was no nervousness, only purpose. I'm not a public speaker, she began, her voice steady. I'm just someone who asked why I was treated differently. A small ripple of emotion moved through the room. I was told to move. I was told, without words, that I didn't look like someone who should sit in first class. And I remember the feeling, not anger, not even shock, just that quiet ache that says, here we go again. She turned slightly toward the audience. But I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene. I just asked a question. Why me? And that question somehow echoed farther than I could have imagined. The air was thick with stillness, every breath in sync, every heart listening. Daniel picked up from her. In the months since Flight 326, we've launched See Me across all departments. But today we're announcing a permanent change in how we train, evaluate, and promote, not just to prevent bias, but to repair what it's broken. A large screen behind them lit up, displaying a new logo, a stylized seat marked 1A with an open eye above it. The SEAT Initiative for Equity, Access, and Trust. This isn't branding, Daniel said. It's acknowledgement. The initiative included a passenger equity officer is assigned to every flight over 4 hours, anonymous accountability portals for all seating conflicts, mandatory quarterly equity training led by third-party human rights educators, scholarship programs in Amira's name for young women of color entering aviation. The auditorium erupted, not with applause, but with something deeper, agreement, alignment. The quiet exhale of people who had waited years to feel heard within their workplace. In the final moments of the program, Daniel stepped aside. Amira remained. I don't want to be remembered as the CEO's daughter who went viral, she said, standing now, her voice clear. I want to be remembered as the girl who didn't give up her seat, not because she couldn't, but because she shouldn't have to. The crowd stood, not out of obligation, but in reverence. After the event, Samantha Raines approached the stage from the back. She wore a standard-issue Aurelia uniform, but with no wings pinned to the collar. She had just completed her final See Me session that week. She said nothing at first, just waited until the room had mostly emptied. When Amira turned, they locked eyes. Samantha stepped forward. Her voice was low but unwavering. You changed me, not because you were angry, but because you weren't. Amira gave a small nod. I didn't have to shout to be heard. I just had to stop walking away. They didn't shake hands. They didn't hug. But in that moment, they understood something that no policy could enforce. Acknowledgement wasn't the end of change. It was the beginning of character. A month later, a bronze seat was unveiled in Concourse C of Aurelia's flagship terminal. It wasn't for sale. It wasn't reserved. It wasn't even labeled first class. Instead, it bore a small inscription etched in quiet defiance. For the ones who were told they didn't belong, for the ones who stayed, and for the ones who made space after seeing them. Travelers sat in it. Some posed for pictures. Others sat silently for a moment longer, feeling the weight of a story they didn't know, but somehow understood. And on one cold morning in November, a girl with a carry-on, a hoodie, and a boarding pass in hand paused in front of the seat, placed her hand on its edge, then moved forward to Gate 18 where her flight to Columbia University was boarding. Her name was Amira Bennett, and she had earned her seat, every one of them. Moral of the story: true power is not in a title or a uniform. It's in how we choose to see others, and whether we dare to correct what we once ignored. One question asked with dignity can echo louder than a scream, and sometimes justice doesn't roar. It takes its seat and waits to be seen.